Hey guys, and welcome to my studio. In my previous video I showed you how to achieve basic watercolor effects using salt, alcohol, water, etc. Probably most of them you already knew or seen, and if you still don't know how they work, you can check out that previous video of mine. In today's video I will try to show you how I actually use these effects in a painting. So I chose to paint a wolf this time in an entirely different way than usual. I will be using wet on wet technique for 90% of the painting, and I will only add a few details using wet on dry in the end. This might look or sound complicated, but it is a very simple technique and a quick painting method. It only took me about 2 hours to complete. So let me show you this process. Maybe you will find it interesting. Maybe you will get something out of this video to enrich your own watercolor painting. So let's get to it. I hope you guys know what wet on wet means, but in case that you don't, I will tell you. I'm about to tell you. Anyway, wet on wet means that you're painting wet paint on a wet surface, which means that the paint will spread and also create soft edges in between those colors that you put down. So the way I start my first layers of painting is to mix all the colors in its lightest versions. So I'm gonna be using light ochre and Vandyke brown for this painting, and just a couple of mid-tones and mix them up a little bit, but these are basically just two main colors that I will be using. So I want to put them down on the paper as soon as possible and wet my paper with them instead of clean water. Oh, and I forgot, I mixed some blue into the Vandyke just to enrich the color palette a bit, and the paints that I was using were Daniel Smith granulating paints, which means that the texture of the paints will help me greatly to suggest furry look on this one. So I will put the material in the description down below so you can find them there, and just so you know that the granulating effect helps a lot with painting watercolor fur, for example. Now the whole paper is wet, I have basic colors down, and I added them to the places where they belong according to my photo reference, and I sprinkled a bit of salt onto the basic paint. Now in the next part I will need to add darker paint to the already wet areas and just enhance contrast, add more differences. For example, the head of the wolf will need to be much darker than it is now, and the top will stay light, but maybe it will need some shading or corrections. I'm still working wet on wet, nothing has dried and I want it to stay wet, so just keep it wet until you're finished, keep it wet. While adding more paint, don't forget to protect your highlights, and the way I do it is by lifting pigment. Again, if you don't know what lifting pigment means, it is basically you just grab a clean wet brush and remove some of the pigment from the wet paper, and of course you will do that in place where you need your highlight. For example, I did that on his ears. I tried to constantly remove pigment around his mouth and on sides of his head, so I don't want any dark paint to cover these areas because it won't look like a wolf in the end. And now I decided that I'm finished. I have all the colors in place, and this is where I leave painting to dry completely, and we'll be continuing with the details afterwards. So this particular painting does not have a lot of details, it's only the mouth, the nose and the eyes, but they are still very important because the rest of the painting is rather suggestive and abstract, semi-abstract, so we want those details to be nice and just give the viewer enough information about what's actually in the painting, so we will have to focus. We always paint details wet on dry because we don't want them to spread, we want them to stay sharp. And as far as my detailing goes, I use synthetic brushes because they hold shape very well, they let me do some really sharp lines and they're just very nice. They're also very cheap, so you should be able to get them without any massive expense. So just grab any sort of thin, synthetic, cheap brush that you have, and that will do, that should do. And did I just refer to myself as we? I'm sorry, I got confused. So it's me, of course. And I'm almost finished with the painting. See, it was not very hard nor long. This is a very, very fun technique. I sincerely hope that you will try that out at home and create something beautiful. Please let me know in the comments if you did actually try the technique, and maybe even link to some of your work so I can check them out. And maybe if you have some questions, please just feel free to leave them as well. And speaking of making more videos, I would really like to make more content and more often, not just like once a month, but like every week, because I really like creating tutorials for you. And you can now help me with that by pledging to me on Patreon. Supporting my work with only $1 a month will make a great difference and will allow me to work much more on this kind of free content for you, but will also give you access to some premium content, such as real-time videos that I already have there, or some work-in-progress shots and step-by-step pictures and so on. Some extra love for you from me. And you have my big thanks even for checking out this video. I really hope the content was helpful for you, and let me know. I will see you shortly. Bye bye.